So I made a little video, a short video just earlier where I said rather glibly, I think, that evolution and intelligent design don't mutually exclude. And the more I think about it, the more I have to come to the same conclusion that in fact they don't mutually exclude, and they might complement one another very well, and that life, evolution, intelligent design, the this idea of fine tuning as well to complement it also, and this notion that the exact parameters of the universe seem contrived to some extent and set up to deliberately give rise to things like life, and that the laws of physics ultimately make life possible in this confluence between physics and chemistry that produces, well, biochemistry, and then the larger structures associated with living organisms, from the cell organelles up to cells, and then ultimately to small single-celled life, and then multicellular organisms, and so on. And we have genetics, and we have the ability to adapt to our environment, which, I mean, is a deeply, well, is a rather intelligent thing to have done if it has indeed been done. And it's hard to see how this could have arisen from blind force, and not from a force that appreciates organisms and intelligence. And yeah, I'm also not saying that life is anything that we could have designed. That's the other thing. And that the universe, in my opinion, represents divinity, and it is a divine fact that life exists, and the structures we see in reality exist. And I think you only need look at the stars and things like this and think that this must be some kind of divine entity, you know, and that it operates via scientific principles, or it operates via, there are laws to reality, I think, well, clearly, but it there also seems to be a sense in which these laws of nature are composed of a divine order to some extent. And when it comes down to questions in physics, such as what fundamentally is material, what is an electron made of, does that question even make sense? How do we make better sense of the world we live in? And in biology, like, how do we explain life? How do we explain how that came about? How do we explain how DNA came about? Was it, DNA first or RNA first? Were there RNA-based organisms, or it's a grand mystery, and we don't we have some inkling, I think, about like how life emerged on Earth, when the conditions for life to emerge, indeed were presented, and everything had cooled down enough, and there was enough sort of water in the oceans from the various comets that would have impacted Earth in its earliest stages of existence. But yeah, the laws of physics could have been very different, I suppose, and if it weren't directed by the will, possibly, of some entity, why do we, for instance, have curiosity about the world? And unless, why is there a notion of intelligence at all, unless an intelligent entity made this and made intelligence possible? If it was completely mute, unintelligent, and inanimate, and not uh and if this has truly emerged out of a nothingness, how is that possible? Do you see what I mean? Like, also, like, on a level, we have this idea of nothingness, that nothingness is a real thing, yet we have no evidence that it exists. We have a notion of empty space, but if we look critically at the cosmos and what fills space, then space is constantly filled with at least radiation, isn't it? Photons, and then neutrinos, and then cosmic ray particles, i.e. protons and electrons. So what we look at when we look at space is that we're not looking at a vacuum at all. We're looking at a soup of particles. And yes, like particles can make it through this soup so that we can detect them at distance, and so we can see distant galaxies and things like this through our telescopes. And the idea of space itself might be a bit erroneous, and it might be a bit deeply misunderstood. I have this notion from Einstein that space curves in the presence of masses, and that it's other objects falling into these gravity wells, these curved regions of space. That's what causes objects to orbit them. And I'm a bit uncomfortable with thinking about that idea because I don't really conceptualize space that way. And I just say, like, if it's curved like that, wouldn't objects be falling into other objects? Whereas we don't really see that so much. The Earth is actually moving away from the sun, not towards it. So one thing I hypothesized once was that there was actually a pushing force of radiation that's pushing the Earth away from the sun. Orthodox science doesn't quite agree with that. What it says is that the sun is constantly losing mass, so that this force of gravity between the Earth and the sun is actually diminishing. Whereas I suppose both could be true at the same time also. The sun is constantly releasing radiation and particles. I don't think we quite know the impact of cosmic ray particles over like what kinetic forces are exchanged or in those processes. Likewise with radiation pressure, that is too small to overcome the sun's gravity, but I don't quite know the kinematics of how these forces would be expounded in space. For instance, the radiation pressure, I think, in spite of a superior force drawing the Earth to the sun, there is this pushing force also pushing it away. Don't know. Can a weaker force overcome a stronger force? I suppose it's a good question, isn't it? And you'd be tempted to say, like, flat out no. But like I said, I don't think we know the full impact of all the particles being emitted from the sun over the Earth and whether or not it can have a pushing force. But likewise, also the sun's gravity is diminishing. So all the time. It's losing billions of tons of material a second. Or maybe hundreds of billion. I don't quite know the exact figure on that one, but yeah, fine-tuning and the theory of the evolution do not mutually exclude. You can say it's intelligent design that God invented evolution, so he can give organisms like a degree of liberty, and not have to constantly control everything, and can just sit back and watch how things develop if that's what pleases God, or the creator or whatever's created this universe. All that. And I do still hold pantheist sympathies. I'm not exactly going to become a deist, but I do believe that God's nature must at least include the physical universe. Otherwise, God wouldn't be infinitely powerful, loving, present, and knowing. And part of his power or its power or this deity's power consists in us, and we exist as part of it. And the process of dying is merely the merge back into the larger totality, and we become, we lose this illusion of separateness. We have this ego death, and possibly even an afterlife. I don't know, and enter some sort of dream state or transcendent state, or maybe even a higher dimensional state. Perhaps that is a sensible notion after all, and these string theory ideas are correct. Because the more I think about my theory of quantum gravity, actually, what I've come up with, this electron densities idea, the more I think like it also doesn't mutually exclude string theory. And I think there's a good chance, a goodish chance, that the four dimensions of reality that we're used to, these three dimensions of space and one of time, aren't necessarily all that exists. I mean, if you're trying to describe all of existence, you are into speculation, and there's no way we'll ever be able to empirically test for extra dimensions. I don't think, not in practicable terms. But it is speculation. I think it's the sort of thing that we'll find out when we die. Um, we'll gain some insight into that when we die, or perhaps even in hallucinogenic experiences before then, such as DMT trips and ayahuasca, which is DMT, and long-lasting DMT, which I had when I was 18 in Peru, and mushroom trips as well. Because I think from my experiences with that, it has sort of opened my mind a bit to string theory. I'm a bit more inclined to accept it, I think, in light of those experiences and what I've seen on those experiences. And mostly with shrooms, actually getting visions of the future and huge like engineering insights and things, and science fiction insights. Hugely insightful, vastly increasing creativity and originality and creativity, which I think is a hugely valuable thing and a great reason to take them. But yeah, I think the more we think about these deep topics of philosophy, such as how something could possibly arise from nothing, how do we conceptualize God? How do we think about our scientific understanding in relation to God? Because also pantheism and deism might not mutually exclude either, because we might be living in a world where indeed the universe is God, but that's not the whole story, and that God has been created by an even greater deity that exists at a higher level to this lower deity, the universe. If you see what I mean, we can't exclude polytheism either. This idea of many gods or many deities. Yeah, I disagree. I think with monotheism. I'm disinclined to believe it. I'm disinclined to believe that everything is an undivided totality. That's certainly the case, I think, for this universe. It's a plenum of matter and energy, but ultimately, it links up with itself, and it's consistent across space to some extent. Yeah, I think that all the division lines, the boundaries we place on things, I think they're sort of arbitrarily drawn, and those more like illusions of human perception. But when you start looking at the universe from an objective standpoint and not considering things like what it looks like to us, but considering more like it in terms of its bare constituents of particles, well, that you build up a very different image of the universe then, and you see things like areas of high concentration of particles, high densities, pressure, that sort of thing, more, and less like a planet or a star or an asteroid or an object within the universe. Like the universe is a container containing a substance, if you see what I mean. More like the universe is a plenum of matter and energy, and we have a narrow perception of it with our senses, but it's far more interconnected and exists in far more of a holism than we probably give it credit for. Although I suppose in a sense it is fair also to say, well, it's not. I don't believe it is fair to say that like the sun is really a separate object from the Earth. We have a solar system, and the sun propagates a gravitational field, but we're trapped within that gravitational field. So in a sense, that the sun's boundary is sort of illusory. And like, where do we say the sun's boundary is? Is it the photosphere, or is it the end of the corona? And where does the corona end? Talking about like the surface of the sun, the photosphere. Then there's all this matter and energy really like trapped in the corona. That's also sort of part of the sun. So these boundaries we place on objects, usually illusions, really, I think. And it does all go together, and it is a holism. Well, the best as I can describe it anyway, I think. And also when it comes to life, I am convinced that Earth is not the only place that life exists in the universe. There's some evidence that bacterial life at least has existed on Mars. And I think as we progress into the outer solar system with our exploration of Jupiter's icy moons, we're going to find very possibly microbial life out there, I think. And we need to send astronauts out there and invest more in space and all this good science stuff. And yeah, I think there's a very good chance we'll find microbes out there, possibly algae or something like this. Possibly some stuff doing photosynthesis for all we know in those places. I don't think many animals exist there, but things like tardigrades exist. So we don't know, maybe. And certainly in other solar systems there are planets with life. I'm convinced of that. In this galaxy, and probably many of them. And I hope many of them. And just think of the sheer variety and diversity of life that exists on Earth. Then take an entirely different planet with its own unique biome. What an amazing discovery that would be. And just to think about that and how exciting it is, I think, that we could get there one day, possibly. And, well, I mean, maybe not even go down to the surface and contaminate it with our bacteria and whatnot. But, yeah, maybe it'll even happen. And we'll get out there and do it, and we won't blow ourselves up before then. That we could be a more integrated, tolerant, more integrated, less divided species. And we've got all these like borders and countries, nation states, and supranational organizations, and in which we bicker all the time about this and that, and try to rein one another in when we don't want to be reined in, and no freedom of movement. Let's say, like, again, like, relax all borders around the globe. Let's just have a federation of planet Earth or something like that. And yeah, maybe one world government. Maybe it'll be better than these constant struggles and fights between neighbors. Was it that Michel de Montaigne said it's the same thing that causes a man to quarrel with a neighbour, causes a war betwixt princes. Something like that. So the more we allow freedom of movement, allow one another to share one another's resources and promotes equality and equanimity around the globe and humanism, then I think the better we will be as a species. And yeah, like that part of that comes down to religious differences. And I don't think like atheism does much to unite religious people. Because they don't share in religion, they stand apart from religion, consider themselves superior to the religious in terms of intelligence very often, and suggest that everyone should abandon their faith. In a sense, it's very Calvinistic, isn't it? It's very puritanical. And I'm just thinking, like, not only abandoning Christianity, which is a beautiful tradition in its own right, in my opinion, but abandoning our paganism, yeah, our spiritual practices, doing things like playing around with tarot cards and the occult and witchcraft and everything else. It's also opposed to that stuff. It's hard rationalism and well, and it's scientism more than it is in the spirit of science, I think, because science arises out of witchcraft, basically, and magic, and these things. And we have things like alchemy in the history of science very often. The cult of Hermes Trismegistus and Hermeticism and the occult, basically. This is really, the mathematician and the mystic were one and the same figure at one point. So, it's very deep. Science and religion are deeply bound up with one another. They both, on a level, serve the curiosity of the species, I think, in their ideal forms. And we were, after all, made curious, which I believe aids our survival, very obviously. The more that we can understand our environment and learn to manage it and control it and profit from it, the better we are able to survive. So, it makes a lot of sense that we would be curious and scientific and experimental and engineering. We have an impulse towards engineering things, making things, tools and structures and the rest of it. So, yeah, I mean, it all arising via random chance is the other alternative, I suppose. But I'm not so certain our laws of physics could have arisen by random chance. The more I understand them, the more it seems like, again, not anything we could have come up with necessarily, but something a divinity could have come up with, something a god could have come up with. And maybe there are other gods out there creating their own universes and managing their own universes, possibly. And there's a vast and infinite continuum of deities beyond what we're aware of. And on the subject of infinity, if we're going to take that prospect seriously, what would that include? That could include an infinite number of dimensions, possibly, and an infinite number of gods, and an infinite number of universes, for all we know. Would it necessarily include that? I don't know. Think too much about that sort of thing, then go quite loopy, I think. Possibly. Dangerous areas of thinking if you get really deep into it. But yeah, nothing in science says that God exists. Also, nothing disproves God. So we say for this reason that God is falsifiable. Not falsifiable, sorry. But I'm just thinking, like, is there a way of disproving God? If there isn't, why even argue about it? If it can't be falsified, are you proven wrong? But it's not a scientific proposition, but why should it not therefore be a serious proposition in philosophy? And if our convictions are geared towards, for instance, the existence of love, I think this is deeply important and deeply connected to an artistic sensibility more than necessarily an empirical scientific one. Because we have evidence that love exists. But why does love exist? Do we need it to survive? Do we need it to have evolution and survival instincts and the rest of it? But why do we love one another? Like why don't we just have sex with the first person who comes along, or the most ideal partner? And that could be a lot of people. We might survive more efficiently that way without love. Love might actually sort of get in the way of things like natural selection. If you think we might not choose a partner, for instance. We might just be sexual, and just go for whoever we're most attracted to, or the next person we're most attracted to, or the next person we're most attracted to, and breed that way, and not take care of children. I don't know. Maybe I don't. Yeah, well, it's more efficient. Maybe it is. but love exists. And we do things like sing songs and write poems and paint paintings and everything else. Music exists. Yeah. Yeah. I wrote a poem once, said, if there's no such thing as a soul, why do we listen to music? So, like, souls exist. This is very important, I think. I believe I have a soul. I don't know about anyone else out there. Maybe they believe I don't have a soul. I will just, go into nothingness when I die. There's nothing after death. I do things that feed my soul. So, like, what is the soul? The sum of the psyche, maybe? I don't think it is quite that. I think it's something deeper than that. Something more uniquely imprinted upon us. Or something more uniquely involved in us. I do believe that. And yeah, I pursue things that speak to my soul. Art, poetry, music, literature, whatever. Yeah, everything that amuses me, gives me joy, gives me sadness, possibly even, and allows me to explore my emotional self. Maybe that's the closest thing we have to a soul. But yeah, if it were driven by blind force and random chance, why would we need love? Why would we need music? Why would we need art? It's an artistic question. And I think I kind of hit the nail on the head actually when I did my drunken philosophy video on the aesthetic argument for God's existence. Beauty exists. Love exists. How can a higher entity not exist? Do you see what I mean? How can an entity that does not appreciate these things ever create a universe like this one, in which these things are present? Do you see that? If it was like a truly malevolent deity, a demon, if it was this Cartesian evil demon creating reality and just deceiving us, why create all this beauty and wonder, and awe for us, ourselves as limited, as finite, limited creatures upon a splendid planet like Earth? Why? And well, to entertain itself possibly, and see what we do, and maybe it doesn't know everything in advance, and maybe we do have free will, and like determinism exists, yes, and we can throw a tennis ball up in the air and it will fall to the ground reliably. That's determinism. But a human isn't exactly a tennis ball. We're a very complex system of electrochemical activity flowing through an enormous array of different structures and substances that go into creating and different forms of tissue that go into creating us, aren't we? And we direct ourselves within the world when we consider ourselves responsible for ourselves. And we're not saying in a state of automatism or something. So yeah, I mean, I believe we have free will. And I also believe that we're a subdivision of God's power. I think, as a pantheist. So I'd also be a panentheist. Believes that, we're, part of God's consciousness is our consciousness, basically. The universe is, after all, conscious. We are conscious. We are part of the universe. And that's roughly how it breaks down. So yeah, I think I've spoken enough about this. I think I made a good point in this video, or a good series of points. I think this one was well worth watching. It was well worth doing, I think. So thank you for watching, everybody. Love you lots, and see you soon.